All right, welcome back to another episode of the Podium Pushers podcast with Justin and Brandon. It may be the summer break for Formula One, but we have not gone anywhere. In fact, some would say we're even stepping it up. We've got more content headed your way today. It is time for our mid-season review. We will be ranking each and every driver on the 2024 Formula One grid, looking at how their season has been so far. Brandon, how you feeling?
I'm feeling great. Like you said, it is the summer break, but I'm excited for this episode and all the content we have coming out over the next couple of weeks. So it's going to be a great time until Formula One is back.
We have got 20 drivers to go through today, so we're going to jump right into it. Here's how this is going to go. I'm going to say the driver, their best result, where they are in the season standings. That doesn't give the full picture, but we'll be giving some context kind of talking about it. Brandon's going to give his rating on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm going to give my rating on a scale of 1 to 10. It's going to be awesome. Go ahead, if you're listening or watching, think of your rating, see where it compares to us. Let's start it off with Sauber going to Zhou Guanyu. Best result of the year is a P11. Season standing is P19. Brandon, what is your rating for Guanyu Zhou?
My rating for Guan Yu Zhou is going to be 2 out of 10. He hasn't really done much this year, and he's done so little to the fact that he's not really even being considered at all, I think, for any other drives in 2025. So kind of unfortunate for him. It was cool to have a Chinese driver on the grid, but right now it's looking like he's not even going to be on the grid next year. So 2 out of 10. I feel like he's kind of been nowhere this season. His best result being P11. He hasn't even scored any points. So it's unfortunate. But yeah.
I think that's a great score. I've been a little more generous. I've given him a 3 out of 10. You're right. He hasn't scored points, but neither has his teammate, and he's technically ahead of Valtteri Bottas in the standings, but it doesn't feel like he's had a better year than Valtteri Bottas, and I think both of our scores will reflect that when we get there. But yeah, I think he's kind of been the new P20 in qualifying merchant. I mean, it's always him and Logan Sargent on the back row, it feels like, but more often than not, he is the one who has been in P20, and it's been a long ways off in my mind. So I've been a little more generous and given him a 3 out of 10, but I feel like we both agree on the state of Guan Yu Zhou's season.
Yeah, not a positive season for him.
Definitely not. All right, moving right along to his teammate, Valtteri Bottas. Best result of P13, season standings P21. What's your rating?
My ranking, I've got Valtteri a 3 out of 10. It seems like, even though the statistics don't show it, that Valtteri has had a better season. I think he's qualified better. Obviously, we just talked about Zhou kind of being at the back of the pack with qualifying, but I feel like Valtteri's qualified consistently better. I feel like he's been a little bit more consistent in where he's been finishing in the races. And everybody loves Valtteri, especially with his off-track shenanigans, cycle racing, and I don't know, skinny dipping, all that stuff that Valtteri likes to do in his free time. So I'm giving him a little bit higher, 3 out of 10.
Yeah, I feel like it's tough to rate Valtteri Bottas just because that Sauber is so bad, and I think he has a bigger gap in talent than it shows between him and Guan Yu Zhou. I've given him a 4 out of 10, so just like you, 1 point higher than his teammate. I mean, it's just been a tough season for Sauber overall. We don't really have much to go off of. They're kind of just racing around at the back, and sometimes their car decides to stop on track, and that's really all you get out of Sauber. So tough season for them, tough season for both the drivers, but we both agree that Valtteri Bottas deserves to be a little bit higher. Logan Sargent, best result of the season, P11, season standing of P20. What is your ranking?
My ranking, I've got Logan at a 4 out of 10, and I know you're probably thinking like Valtteri is just at a 3 out of 10. You're ranking Logan Sargent above him. I'm going to say yes. I think Logan comparatively has had a bit of a better season against the expectations that were had for him. I think Logan has shown a true step up in form. Hasn't yielded much statistically for Logan in terms of points or anything like that. But I think Logan has kind of beat the expectations slightly that were had for him by the general public for the season. So I think Logan's had a decent season. Obviously, it's not going to result in him driving in Formula One past the end of the season, but I think he's had a decent season.
Hey, there's technically still seats open on the grid, so Logan Sargent could have a drive next year. I'm not expecting it, though. I've gone lower than that. I gave Logan a 3 out of 10, And it was almost the opposite reason, because I was like, I feel like I have to go against this almost like expectation bias we have for Logan Sargent. I think there's a small part of us that are like, he didn't Bennett this weekend. That's a great weekend from Logan. In reality, it has not been good. He still has never out-qualified Alex Albon in an actual Grand Prix qualifying session, but he did do it in some sprint qualifying, so good for him. I agree. I think it has been better than last season, and he has taken a step forward, but I still don't think it's been a great season from Logan Sargent. All right, moving on to Alex Albon, best result of P9, season standings P18. I'm giving him a 6 out of 10. I think tough to rate Alex Albon. Again, doesn't really have a teammate to compare him to, but I think it's been a step back from last year. I know Williams have also maybe taken a step back from last year in hopes that they will take a step forward in the future, but I feel like we just haven't seen as many standout performances from Alex Albon this year as we did last year, but I still think it's been a solid year from him, so I've given him a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I think it's a good take. I've given Alex a little bit lower, 5 out of 10. Just because, for me on this 10-point scale, 5 has got to be average. And I think Alex has performed kind of right down the middle, average. He's done, well in some races. He hasn't done well in some other races. And, I think he's been pretty average. He's had some good performances, some bad performances, and, he's obviously done enough for Williams to lock him up for a couple more years. So I think he is in a good spot with Williams, and I think he's had pretty average season. So far, so good.
All right, moving on to Pierre Gasly, best result of P9, season standing of P15. What is your rating?
A 6.5 out of 10. We're getting into the 0.5s here, but I think Pierre has done well. He's been above average. He's had some good races. He's had some good qualifyings. That Alpine was nowhere at the beginning of the year, and it's kind of gotten somewhere, much to our surprise, throughout the first half of the season. But I think Pierre's had a good season. I think he has a good relationship with the team. Esteban Ocon, we'll talk about him in a second, but I think Pierre has kind of beat him, and pretty easily this season so far. So we'll see how the rest of the season plays out. But I think Pierre's had a decent season. 6.5 out of 10 for me.
I have not gotten into the 0.5s yet, but very similar rating. I've gone for a 6 out of 10 for Pierre Gasly. I agree with you. I think he has gotten the better of Esteban Ocon just slightly. I think they always manage to find each other on track, and they're very similarly talented drivers. But in my mind, I think Pierre Gasly just has the edge, and I think that is reflected most weekends, most sessions. Pierre Gasly is slightly ahead of Esteban Ocon. I know at the beginning of the year, like you said, Alpine were terrible, but they've slowly made their way back, got a couple of point-scoring races. So Pierre Gasly gets a 6 out of 10 from me. Esteban Ocon, best result of P9, season standings of P17. I'm giving him a 5 out of 10. I think he's just slightly behind Pierre Gasly. Very similar results, very similar point scorings, very similar standings. They're all right there. I kind of had similar seasons, struggling with the Alpine and then kind of getting somewhere and scoring some points now. He does have to be behind Pierre Gasly, in my opinion, just because of the absolute headache he is to the team, just for that performance in Monaco when he ran it into Pierre, and because he's the one who's losing his seat instead of Pierre. And I think some of that was motivated by how difficult it is to work with Esteban Ocon behind the scenes. So have had to dock him a point, but 5 out of 10. It's been an all right season for Esteban Ocon.
Yeah, I've actually gone with a 4 out of 10, particularly for the reason that you just talked about. I think he's a horrible teammate. He's never really had anybody in Formula One that he's worked well with as a teammate. And it always seems to be the story that, like, all right, where's Esteban going? Okay, who's going to be his teammate? Are they going to get along? Probably not. So I think I've given him a 4 out of 10, just kind of poor performances. He did have a decent race in Belgium, finishing in the points and then getting promoted another position up the way after George's disqualification. But yeah, 4 out of 10. Performed below expectations. He hasn't given Alpine what they needed, which is why he's not driving for them next season. So
I think that's a great rating as long as we both agree that he's below Pierre Gasly. I think we're onto something. Kevin Magnussen, best result of P8. He is between the Alpine drivers and P16 in the driver standings. What is your rating?
My rating for Kevin Magnussen, I've gone with a 4.5 out of 10. Just because I feel like Kevin, he's done some good things this season, especially towards the beginning of the season. He had that race in Saudi Arabia where he was holding everyone up so that Nico could get the gap to pit and still score points. I think that was really cool. But he's also had some bad races, some bad performances. I'm thinking of Monaco, crashed into Checo there, and he's done some things that have obviously been very detrimental to the team. So I've gone with 4.5 out of 10.
I agree with you. I've gone for a 4.5 out of 10 as well. Like you said, playing the team role in Saudi Arabia, doing the same thing in the sprint in Miami, so Nico could score points there as well. But he's been pretty soundly beat by his teammate, and it makes sense to me that he is no longer racing for Haas next year, and he probably, almost definitely, won't be in the sport next year. It's really weird. Whenever he got signed back to Haas in 2022, I mean, he threw in some incredible performances at the beginning of that year, and then it's kind of just been downhill ever since. Anytime he beats Nico, it's a pretty big surprise. And so, yeah, I feel like a 4.5 out of 10 is pretty fair for Kevin Magnussen. His teammate Nico Hülkenberg, best result of P6, sits P11 in the season standings right now. I've gone for an 8.5 out of 10 for Nico Hülkenberg. I originally had him down as a 9, but have decided to dock it just a little bit because I can't let the recency bias of those two P6s weigh too much in my mind. Those are great performances, don't get me wrong, but even in the couple races afterwards, he's kind of been let down a little bit. We almost expected a little bit more from him, and he hasn't performed in a couple of occasions. It hasn't been a perfect season, but it's been a very good season from Nico Hülkenberg, and I think an 8.5 captures that really well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, Nico has had a fantastic season. He scored a lot of points for the team. Every single time, he's performing really well. It's like, man, of course, it's Nico Hülkenberg bringing that Haas up, to places where maybe it shouldn't be. But yeah, he's had a great season. I've also gone with 8.5 out of 10. I went with 8.5 because, down the line, when we talk about some of the other drivers on the bigger teams, I've given them a little higher scores. I just think Nico's not at their level this season. So that's why I didn't go any higher than 8.5 with Nico, but yeah, he's had a fantastic season. It's been a lot of fun to watch him drive.
He's been putting in solid performances in the Haas, but he has been missing just a little bit of consistency. I think that's why I can't give him any higher than an 8.5. It sounds like we're on the same page with that for sure. Yuki Tsunoda, best result of the year, P7, season standings of P12. What is your rating?
My rating, I've gone with a 6.5 out of 10 for Yuki. Similar, I think he's been above average. He's had some good performances. He's also had some bad performances, some weekends where it's like, man, where's VCARB, where's Yuki? Kind of just running around in the midfield, not really going anywhere. But yeah, I think he's had a decent season. It's unfortunate for him that he hasn't really been seriously considered for other seats, but he'll be back at RB next year in 2025. So that's good for him. It'll be fun to continue to watch him develop, but I'm excited to see what he can do for the rest of the season. Hopefully it's good, but not better than Daniel.
I pretty much agree with everything you've said there. I would give Yuki a 7 out of 10. Started the season off very strong after the first 3 rounds. He was really carrying RB and appeared to have the upper hand on Daniel. Then Daniel did get that chassis change, and things have kind of evened out, maybe even moved more in Daniel's favor. So I think he's cooled off a little bit as we've gone further into the season. Yuki Tsunoda still has that weird thing where sprint weekends, he just decides that he can't qualify after 1 practice sessions and puts it in P18. I don't know what's going on with that. But I think it's been a solid weekend from a season from Yuki Tsunoda. I think there is clear improvement in his career. I think he's taken another step forward. It is a shame that he's not being considered for that Red Bull seat, but I still don't think he would necessarily thrive in that seat. It's kind of just like he would be someone who could replace Sergio Perez. So I think it's been a good season, been an average season for Yuki Tsunoda in some ways, but I don't think he can really complain about it. Yuki Tsunoda's teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, best result of P8, sitting right behind Yuki in P13 in the season standings. I've gone for a 7 out of 10 for him as well. I really think you can't separate the RB drivers all that much. We saw a great start to the year from Yuki, but we've seen a really great last couple of races from Daniel. I think they're very similar in qualifying pace, very similar in race pace these days. That's why they seem to be near each other on track in both qualifying and races. So I think they've had fairly similar seasons, and I've given Daniel the same rating of a 7 out of 10.
I've also given Daniel a 7 out of 10, but I guess I had to put him above Yuki. And this is probably just a personal bias, but I think Daniel's had a pretty decent season, similar to Yuki. He didn't start off the year great, got a chassis change. He's done a lot better since then. However, like, what separates them for me, justifying that separation in my rankings at least, is that Daniel is being, rumored and considered for like the Red Bull seat, and Yuki is not. And there's a reason for that. And I think that's because Daniel is just an overall better driver, and he's had in the eyes of some people, a better season. And those people being not just me, but maybe like Christian Horner, Marco, those people. And, people probably trust them a lot more than they trust me when it comes to Formula One. So I'm letting them do the talking for me. So that's why I've given Daniel a 7 over Yuki's 6.5. But I've been pleased with Daniel's season. It's been a good one.
Clearly, I agree because we've given him the same grade. Lance Stroll, best result of P6, sits P10 in the standings. What have you rated him?
I've given Lance a 6 out of 10. Again, I just think he's been kind of a little bit above average, a little bit. He's beat those expectations that we had for him a little bit. And, I don't think he's done amazing things. But, P10 in the season standings, it isn't bad at all. So I think it's been a better than expected season for Lance. And, we'll see him again next year.
Yeah, I've given him a 7 out of 10. I think it's been a kind of underrated season from Lance Stroll, and I don't know if that's because maybe Fernando Alonso hasn't been performing as well as we expected, but there was a good stretch of 4 or 5 races where it felt like Lance Stroll was there or thereabout with Fernando, even out qualifying and out finishing him a couple times. So for him to be sitting P10, which is, where you would argue that Aston Martin probably is, the 5th fastest car most weekends, kind of sitting there between Formula A and Formula B. And so I think he's doing really all you can expect from him. I think he's been more consistent than we've seen in years past, hasn't really had those classic Lance Stroll crashes when Fernando Alonso ends up on the podium type weekends that we've expected. So I think it's been a fairly good year from Lance Stroll, and I've given him a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I think that's more than fair.
Moving on to his teammate Fernando Alonso, best result of P5. He sits P9 in the season standings. I've given him a 7.5 out of 10, only a half point higher than his teammate, because he really hasn't outperformed his teammate all that much this year. Started out the season clearly having that teammate gap that we've come to expect from Fernando Alonso. And then as we've gotten further and further into the season, the gap has kind of shrunk and they've been near to each other on track. And I don't know if that's the direction of the car's development or age finally catching up to Fernando Alonso, but I think this is definitely a step back from last season for him and the performances that he's getting out of that Aston Martin. So I can only give him a 7.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm giving Fernando a 7 out of 10. I think he's performed well this season, but I don't think, after last season, all the podiums he got, nearly winning in like Monaco, I feel like he's had a good season, but it's not, great. It's not really comparable to last season. So I've given him a 7 out of 10. I think it's been a good year for Fernando, and I think he's outperformed Lance just slightly. So he gets one more ranking point than Lance does from me. I'm excited to see what he can do the rest of the season. Hopefully Aston Martin develops the car well. It seems like they have a lot of good personnel in the team, like leadership-wise and engineering-wise. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, well, it has never happened in the past. It seems like Aston Martin upgrades always go backwards. So that might be wishful thinking. George Russell, best result of the year, P1, season standings, P8. What is your rating?
I've given George an 8 out of 10. He's had some really great performances this year. He's taken that Mercedes and put it on pole. He's won one race. He finished another race P1 and then was disqualified. That was a great drive from him. But yeah, he's done a lot of great things this season in the Mercedes, and I think George deserves an 8 out of 10.
I agree. I've given George an 8.5 out of 10. I think he's had a very good season. I don't think that P8 in the driver standings reflects his year at all. I think he's had some pretty poor luck. If you look back on it, that retirement from Silverstone after qualifying on pole there, obviously his disqualification from the last race before the summer break in Belgium. If both of those races go different ways, he's probably sitting more around P6 in the driver standings. I look back towards the beginning of the year where he was quite soundly outperforming Lewis Hamilton in qualifying and the races. They've been closer recently, but George still has the massive lead over him in those qualifying and race head-to-heads because of the start he got at the beginning of the season. It's more unfortunate that he hasn't had that edge when the Mercedes has been as good, so maybe it doesn't reflect in the points standings as much. But I think George has had a great year, and I've had to give him an 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I think that's a more than fair rating for George, and I'm excited to see how the teammate battle goes. Obviously it's been very close between them so far this season, and I think Mercedes is going to make some noise these last few races of the season.
Yeah, I would be surprised if Mercedes have won their last race of 2024. Moving on to Lewis Hamilton, whose best result is also P1. He sits P6 in the season standings. I've given him an 8 out of 10, so a little bit behind George Russell. I think they've had very comparable seasons, especially over the last couple of races. But I can't just have recency bias. I have to look back in the past towards the start of the season, and George just had a much better first quarter, you could say, of the season than Lewis Hamilton did, out-qualifying him fairly frequently, out-racing him on multiple occasions as well. So I've got to put Lewis Hamilton just a little bit behind George Russell with an 8 out of 10, but I still think it's been a solid season from Lewis, and I think he has a lot of momentum right now as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we look back at the end of the year and do this again, and his ranking has gone up in my mind for sure.
I've given Lewis an 8.5 out of 10, so a little bit higher than George, and I probably have a little bit of recency bias here from Belgium when he inherited the win from George's disqualification. But I think that Lewis has really gotten his mojo back. Silverstone seems to have injected a lot of life into Lewis Hamilton, and he's done a great job so far this season. I think he's just a little bit higher than George in my mind, so I'm excited to see what happens the rest of the season between the two of them, and I'm expecting more race wins, honestly, for both of those drivers before the season's over.
Yeah, they've got a very close teammate battle now, especially that car is getting better, and Lewis Hamilton does seem to have a little bit of his mojo back after that Silverstone win, so very close teammate battle for sure. Charles Leclerc, best result, also P1, sits P5 in the driver's standings. What is your rating?
My rating, I've given Charles a 7.5 out of 10. This might be a little bit low, but I'm sticking with it. I think Charles has had a season of up and downs. Ferrari started off the season really, really strong. Charles obviously got the win in Monaco, which was a really cool thing to watch him win his home Grand Prix. But after that, he kind of dipped back down, and then more recently he's turned things back up a little bit. So it's been a season of ups and downs for Charles, but I think that it's been a good season for him so far. Above average, definitely, and just a little bit behind Mercedes guys.
This might be the biggest disagreement we have in these rankings. I've given Charles an 8.5 out of 10. I think it's been a good year from him. He had that time at the beginning of the year where people were saying that Ferrari dropped the wrong driver and Carlos Sainz was having this great start to the year. I always thought that was a little bit overblown because Charles was still having a great start to the year, still getting P4s and a couple of podiums. And then he had a little bit of a dip that almost coincided with Ferrari's drop in pace after Monaco. And then I think more recently, Charles has picked it back up, got a couple of podiums in a row now. I think he's pretty soundly, beating Carlos Sainz. The gap still isn't super big, but I do think Charles very clearly has the upper hand again. And so I've given him an 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I think you can definitely make that argument for sure. And it's been really, really close between Charles and Carlos this year.
All right, moving on to Charles Leclerc's teammate Carlos Sainz. Best result of P1, season standings of P3, which I'm just now realizing in my mind is flipped. Charles Leclerc is in P3, Carlos Sainz is in P5. That is true. No one in the comments come and yell at us because I have rectified my mistake, even though I wrote it down wrong on our prep sheet. So best result of P1, season standing of P5 for Carlos Sainz. I've given Carlos Sainz an 8 out of 10. I think it's been a very solid year from him, especially at the beginning of the year. Had a great run of form, getting that win in Australia right after having to miss a race because he had to go have surgery. That's crazy. Great performance from him. Has to carry a lot of weight. I think he's been close to Charles, maybe even closer to Charles than they've been in their whole time as teammates. He's got a couple of podiums as well this year outside of his win. So I've given him an 8 out of 10, just a little bit behind Charles, but still a very solid year for Carlos Sainz.
Yeah, I have given Carlos a 7.5 out of 10, so the exact same ranking as Charles. I think, it's also been a year of ups and downs for Carlos. I think this has been his best season so far at Ferrari. I agree with you. I think they're probably closer now than they ever have been before. I think that's just a sign of Carlos maturing as a driver and just becoming more and more consistent. So I've given him a 7.5 out of 10. Again, just because I think they've had a little bit worse of this season than the Mercedes drivers. So that's what I've gone with.
Best season at Ferrari, you've given him a 7.5 out of 10. That is crazy.
It is a little crazy, but I mean, it's hard to rank these guys, but I just feel like based on where Mercedes and the other guys are at, I think that's what I got to give the Ferrari guys.
Hey, it's a fair ranking. I'm not going to argue with your rankings. It's hard work. Someone's got to do it. We're here to do it. And, I think it's a great ranking. All right, moving right along to the McLaren boys. We've got Oscar Piastri up next. Best result of P1, season standings P4. What is your rating?
I'm giving Oscar a 9 out of 10. This one was a really tough decision. I think Oscar's had a great year, especially the last few races. He's been really, really consistent. Obviously, picking up his first win in Formula One, which is super exciting. A little bit of a weird situation surrounding it with team orders and stuff, but that's okay. Oscar had a great drive. He's had a lot of really good finishes and consistency this year. Shown a big step up in form from last year. So I've given Oscar a 9 out of 10. Highest rating so far for me.
I really, really wanted to give him a 9 out of 10, but I had to give him an 8.5 out of 10, mainly because of his slow start to the year. It has kind of caused this gap to Lando Norris, his teammate, in the points. I think some of it was bad luck. I think of Carlos Sainz absolutely sending it into him at Miami and things like that. So some of it has been out of his control, but I do agree with you. I think recently, something must have clicked within him in that McLaren. I think he's had a much better race pace. He hasn't had much issues with tire wear like he did last year. And so I think Oscar Piastri is definitely trending in the right direction. So I have given him an 8.5 out of 10. His teammate, Lando Norris, best result of P1, sits P2 in the season standings. I've given him a 9 out of 10. I think he's had a slightly better year than Oscar Piastri. I think this has been Lando Norris's best year in Formula One, as shown by his P2 in the driver standings, getting his first win and things like that. I think he has let himself down on a couple of occasions, making some mistakes, and you can definitely have the recency bias of a couple more recent Lando Norris mistakes, but I think you look back at the beginning of the year, he was very, very consistent for a lot of rounds in a row, so I can't dock him too much on that. I still think it's been a great year. He's still within a chance of the Drivers' Championship. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen, but there's still a chance, and I think that's something that none of us expected to be saying over the summer break when we started the year. So it's been a great year for Lando. It's been a great year for McLaren, but there have been some small mistakes that have prevented me from going even higher than a 9 out of 10.
I've also given Lando a 9 out of 10. I think that he's had a fantastic year. He obviously, picked up his first win in Miami. That was a super awesome race. And I'm giving him the same rating as Oscar just because I think that they have both some good luck and some bad luck. Lando, has had a couple races where he, was fighting Max a little bit, and I think that's kind of hurt him in the championship standings a little bit. But that's okay. I agree with you. I think the best season he's had in Formula One. And I know Lando's going to continue to get better. So I'm interested to see where the rest of the season goes with those two drivers driving for McLaren as well as next year, because they're both so close that it's going to be really, really interesting to see how they do. Because, I think McLaren has one of the best driver lineups on the grid right now. So it'll be super interesting.
I don't want to spoil some of our upcoming summer break content, but I've got a bold prediction about the McLaren teammates that we'll go over later in the summer break. So I'll just leave you guys with a little cliffhanger for that one. Moving on to our penultimate driver of our midseason driver ratings, Sergio Perez. Best result of the year, P2. Only driver in the top 8 to not have a little P1 right there. Season standings, P7. Brandon, what is your rating for Sergio Perez?
I have given Sergio a 3 out of 10. He had a good, solid start to the season. Finishing a couple races in P2, giving Red Bull, what they needed for the Constructors' Championship. And since then, it just seemed like he's been absolutely nowhere. So, it's been a serious run of bad form for him, to the point where there was heavy rumors that he was going to be replaced by the likes of Daniel Ricciardo or maybe Liam Lawson in the Red Bull seat. Ultimately, Christian and Helmut decided that he is going to stay the rest of the season at Red Bull. So we'll see what happens. I think still anything is possible with that seat, especially if Sergio continues to perform the way he has been. And I think Red Bull is definitely in danger of losing the Constructors' Championship because of his performance. So we'll see if we can turn it around. I do enjoy watching Checo race, definitely a Checo fan, but it's not been a great season for him.
Yeah, it's been a pretty rough season for him. I've given him a 2 out of 10. It's my lowest grade. Maybe he hasn't had the worst season overall as any of the drivers, but I don't care. He's getting a 2 out of 10. He's getting the lowest grade because he's in a Red Bull and he has had an awful season. He should be P8 in the standings, but George Russell's disqualification has saved him from that fate. But it's just been an awful year from Sergio, from getting eliminated in qualifying when he shouldn't, from having more crashes than we can count. It's just been an awful year from Sergio Perez. I even think, he had a good start to the year, kind of, but even when Max had the DNF in Australia, Sergio was nowhere and finished that race down the order. So he hasn't even had as good of a start as we would expect. It feels like his slump started earlier, and it's been worse than it has in years past. I think it's just been a terrible season from Sergio Perez, and I've given him a 2 out of 10.
Yeah. I'm excited to see what kind of Sergio Perez gears in the F1 outlet stores at the race in Austin this fall. I'm just joking, but yeah, it's not been a great season for Sergio, but I'm glad he's still in the sport. I think he's a great driver. But I think it's just been a really tough year for him.
Good driver. It's just not working with Red Bull. Something needs to change, both for the sake of the team, and it can be very easy to dog on Sergio Perez, but also for the sake of him and his career, it looks like something needs to change. But moving on to our last driver, last but certainly not least, Max Verstappen. Best result of P1, sits P1 in the standings as well. I've given him a 9.5 out of 10, and I think that's a very high rating. Obviously, he's been the best driver on the grid, even though he has had some more mistakes this year than maybe we're used to having from Max Verstappen. But I still have to give him a 9.5 out of 10. Still have to give him the highest rating. He's been the class of the field. I think he is the best driver on the grid right now. I think we've still seen performances from him in that Red Bull in the last couple of races before the summer break, where he was dragging it where it shouldn't be. I think there were a couple races where McLaren or even Mercedes were the fastest car, and Max Verstappen still found a way to end up on the top step of that podium. And the fact that he's still finding ways to increase his championship lead on Lando Norris is pretty astounding some weekends. So I think he is still very clearly showing his talent, and I've given him a 9.5 out of 10.
I agree with you. I've given Max Verstappen a 9.5 out of 10. I'm a perfect 10 because he hasn't been perfect this year. He's made more mistakes this year than he has in the past. I think the RB20 isn't comparatively as good as the RB18 was, or maybe even the RB18 was against the rest of the field. We've seen some more mistakes from Max, but I do think he has been the best driver on the grid so far this year, despite that. So I've given him the highest ranking, 9.5 out of 10. It's been a great year for Max so far, and he's probably going to win his 4th Drivers' World Championship.
Yep, we agree. We have also given Max Verstappen the same score. He is very clearly the best driver on the grid. 9.5 out of 10 all around from us for Max Verstappen. There it is. All 20 drivers rated by us at the halfway point of the season. A little over halfway, but it's the summer break, so this seemed like the perfect time to do it. Brandon, before we leave these lovely people, what are your parting podium thoughts?
Parting podium thoughts. I'm excited for the rest of the season, rest of the content we have that's coming out over the summer break. It's going to be awesome. Really appreciate everyone's support. Justin and I love to get to do this podcast together and share it with other people. And it means a lot that you guys are following along. So thank you so much for that. And we're excited.
Yep, a lot of things to be excited about here over at the Podium Pushers. Have a lot of content still to come over the summer break and for the rest of the 2024 Formula One season. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Podium Pushers podcast. As always, you can like, follow, subscribe wherever you are listening. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, all of the places. Wherever you are online, we are there too, making content for you to consume, and you can totally follow along wherever you are. We appreciate each and every one of you guys' support, like Brandon said, and we will see you in the next episode.
See ya.